Today's daf is daf nun beis. And we're going to begin 6 lines down from the top Ilema. Now, let's reiterate the suffix of the Gemara as far as what's called amatraxin. And this was a mechita, kotzel, that was 1 amma thick, and it separated in the first bias between the Kodesh Kadoshim and the Heichal. And the question was, the Chachamim vacillated in the period of time after Shlomo HaMelech about the status of that area of the Amatraxin. Was that considered part of the Kodesh Kadoshim, or was it part of the Heichal? And that was the suffix that the Gemara had. Maskif lo Ravina my time. Ravina doesn't understand why the Chachamim would have had a doubt, a suffix, and vacillated about whether this Amma was included in the Kodesh Kadoshim or in the Heichal. Ilay mishum dechsiv, if you're going to tell me that the source of the suffix is the pasuk in Malachim Aleph Perek Vav with regard to the first bias, Bayis Asher Banosh HaMelech Shlomo Hashem Shishim Amma Orko V'Yasrim Rachbo Ushloshim Amma Kamaso. The orech, the length of the Beis Hamikdash, which means the Heichal and the Kodesh Kadoshim together, was 60 amma. Uksiv, and further it says in the same chapter, the Arboim Ba'ama Hoya Habayis Hu HaHeichal Lefonai. In other words, that when you take this 60 amma, 40 amma of that 60 was the length of the Heichal. So we therefore have 20 amma, the length of the Kodesh Kadoshim, 40 amma, the length of the Heichal, all totaling 60 amma, ksiv. And a few psukim later, it says there in the same chapter, Lifnei Hadvir, the Dvir is the mechitza that separates between the Heichal and the Kodesh Kadoshim. Esrim Amma Orech, the Esrim Amma Rochav, the Esrim Amma Komasal. In other words, when you go lifnim towards the Kodesh Kadoshim of the Mechitza that separates between the Eichel and the Kodesh Kadoshim, which is what we call this Dvir Amatraxin, that was a place that was Arko V'Rochvo V'Govo 20 Amma. Each one, the length, the width, and the height was 20 amma. That's the Kodesh Kadoshim. That's lifnim, lifnei hadvir, going inside, beyond the dvir. V'lo yadina, and if you're going to tell me, says Ravina, that the suffix, what the Chachamim vacillated about, was the following: that this place, which is called Amatraxin, imehani esrim, is it included in the 20 amma? That's lifnei advir, meaning lifnim, inside the Kodesh Kadoshim. So it means that the airspace of the Kodesh Kadoshim, if you're going from the east, inside, inner, towards the west of the Kodesh Kadoshim, is only 19 amma, and then you add the amma of the traxin, of the mechitz itself, to come up with 19 plus 1 is 20 amma. Or alternatively, I mehani arboim, or does it belong to the 40 amma that's outside the Kodesh Kadosh, meaning the Heichal, which would mean that the airspace of the Heichal going from east to west is 39 amma. So Ravina says, no. That suffix, whether or not in calculating the 40 amma and the 20 amma, whether we include the amatraxin or not in the calculation, so it's really 39 plus 1 or 19 plus 1. No. Dilma, it doesn't make sense. Lo mehani esrim v'lo mehani arboim. You're telling me that the suffix was whether or not we calculate the amatraxin as part of the 20, meaning the Kodesh Kadoshim, and the Kodesh Kadoshim is 19 plus 1, or was the calculation of 40, meaning the orech, the length of the Heichal, 39 plus 1, meaning the Amatraxin was included in the calculation of the Heichal. No, no, no. That doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to assume that these calculations of the 40 and the 20, the Heichal and the Kodesh Kadoshim, do not include the Amatraxin at all. The Amatraxin is not included neither in the 20 Amma of the Orech Kodesh Kadoshim, nor in the 40 Amma of the Orech of the Heichal. Lo mihani esrim, v'lo mihani arboim. V'chalolo kochoshven, when the pasuk is calculating the amos of the orech, it's calculating the airspace minus the halal. Minus the traxin. It's all halal, so it's 40 amos of the airspace of the heichal minus the amma of the traxin, and 20 amma of the airspace of the kodesh kadosh minus the amma of the traxin. The rocha of amma, the width of the amma of the mechitza itself, is not part of the calculation. And I'm going to prove that to you, says Ravina, from a Mishnah in Masechet Midos. The Mishnah is calculating the cheshbon of the 40 amma and the 20 amma, the 40 amma, the heichal, the 20 amma of the Kodesh Kadoshim. You'll see that the Mishnah is calculating minus the amma traxin, minus the thickness of the wall, pure airspace. Teda the kol heichal the kochoshev kosolim, when the Tana of the Mishnah is calculating the ksolim, choshev le'ledidei, he has a separate calculation of the thickness of the ksolim. The thickness of the ksolim is not swallowed up in the area of the Kodesh Kadoshim or the Heichal and those calculations. Rather, there's a calculation unto itself of the mechitzos, of the thickness of the ksolim. This now we learned through the Mishnah Midos. A Heichal here in this context refers to the entire Beis HaMikdash, meaning both the what we call the Heichal technically and the Kodesh Kadoshim. Here the word Heichal includes the Kodesh Kadoshim. Was Mea al Mea, Verum Mea. It was 100 amma going from east to west, 100 amma from north to south, and 100 amma in height. And now the Mishnah goes into detail what's included in that calculation of 100 amma going from east to west inside the Beis HaMikdash. Number one, you should know as a separate calculation, says the Mishnah, that the kotzel, the thickness of the kotzel, the outer kotzel of the ulam was the area before the heichal, on the Azara side of the heichal, and the ulam had a kotzel, and its outer wall, the outer wall of this ulam was chamesh amos. He's calculating the wall itself, the thickness of the kotzel. And the Mishnah goes on and says, "Vid ha'ulam," and the actual airspace of the ulam that separated the azor from the heichal was achadesrei amma, was 11 amos. That's the area of the ulam. And now the kosel ha'heichal was sheish amos, meaning the thickness of the kosel on the eastern side of the heichal, which is between the ulam and the heichal, was 6 amos the arko, and the halal itself was arboim amma. So we see that there's a separate calculation for the 40 amma of the heichal, plus a separate calculation independent sheish amos of the kosel of the heichal, and then the amatraxin, that's the thickness of the kosel that's separated between the heichal and the kodesh kadoshim. And how long was the kodesh kadoshim? Esrei amma, base kodesh kadoshim. Kosel heichal, there was a wall around the inner side of the Kodesh Kadoshim. The wall of the Kodesh Kadoshim that would be all the way into the west was 6 amma. So that wall on the western side was 6 amma thick, and vita, and there were lishkos, different kinds of offices and structures that were on the western side of that kosel of the Kodesh Kodashim, and each one of those offices or chambers had a midah of 6 amos. The hakosel, the thickness of the wall of that extra compartment, that chamber, was chamesh amos. But in any event, we see clearly from the Mishnah Midos that when we calculate the length of the Beis Hamikdash going from east to west, and it was 100 amma made up of 40 and 20, it's not including the amas kakosel. He's not talking about the amma of the kosel that's separated between the heichal and the kodesh kodashim. That was calculated as an independent calculation. So beyond the 40 amma of airspace of the heichal, or the 20 amma of the halal, the airspace of the kodesh kodashim, there was an amma of the kosel. So it couldn't be that the suffix was whether or not the amatraxin is included in the 40 of the heichal, that's 39 plus 1, or in the 20 of the Kodesh Kodashim, 19 plus 1. Ella, but rather, what was the suffix, the vacillation of the Chachamim regarding the amatraxin? The amatraxin, again, had an amma that's not calculated neither within the calculation of 40 amas of the airspace of the heichal, or the 20 amas of the airspace of the Kodesh Kodashim, but rather Kedusha say they vacillated about the sanctity. What level of sanctity? How do we define or categorize that area of the 1 amma? Is it a Kedusha kilifnim, kilachutz, or alternatively kilachutz? Does it have the Kedusha of the Kodesh Kodashim, or does it have the Kedusha of the heichal? V'hainu di'amar Rabbi Yochanan, and we're going to see now that this vacillation, this suffix about the makom of the amatraxin, whether it has the sanctity of heichal or kodesh kodashim, it's really a suffix. If we go back to the root of it, of Yosef ish Hotzel, Yosef who came from Hotzel, we'll see exactly his names a little later on. He had many names. And he was talking about a pasuk in Malachim Aleph Perek Vav with regard to the building of the Beis Hamikdash Rishon. And there's a certain ambiguity in this pasuk. You can interpret this pasuk in 2 different ways. The pasuk says udvir. Again, dvir is the mechitza. B'tol habayis pnima heichin l'sitein sham es haron bris Hashem. Now we're certainly talking about Shlomo HaMelech building the Beis Hamikdash and the Kodesh Kodashim, where he's going to place the Aron Bris Hashem. Iboilu. Here is the suffix of Yosef ish Hotzel. Heichi, or Hachi ka'amar kra. This is the first possibility. Number 1, the pasuk means udvir b'soch habayis. So you put a comma after the word habayis, and it means the dvir, the mechitza, that Shlomo Melech set up to separate between the heichal and kodesh kodashim. Now we read the next part of the pasuk. Mipnima heichin l'sitein shamas haron bris Hashem. In other words, on the inner part of the mechitza, as we go west, he prepared an airspace, which we call the Kodesh Kodashim, to put there the Aron Bris Hashem. In other words, it means that the Makom HaMechitza does not have the status of Kodesh Kodashim. Why? Because Mipnima, on the other side of the Mechitza, going west, that part is sanctified with Kedushas Kodesh Kodashim. And that's one way of reading the pasuk, in which case we put the comma after the word Abayis, Odilma, Achikam. Or shall we assume the following interpretation of the pasuk? Udvir b'toch Abayis, instead of putting a comma after the word Abayis, you add the word Mipnima. In other words, he made a mechitza between the Heichal and Kodesh Kodashim, and that mechitza was made bitoch habayis pnima, and that's where he prepared to put the Aron Kodesh, Heichin Loses Sham Es Haron B'Ris Hashem. But it means he prepared a place at that entranceway into the Kodesh Kadoshim, where he would place the Aron. But the Makom HaMachitz itself is Dvir B'toch Habayis Pnima. The Dvir itself, the Machitz itself, has the sanctity of Pnima, of going into the west of the Kodesh Kadoshim. So we see clearly that Ravina's question about whether the way he interpreted the suffix of the Chachamim, whether the Amatraxin has the Kedusha of Heichal or the Kedusha of Kodesh Kadoshim, that's really what Yosef Ish Hutzal was vacillating about in terms of how to interpret this pasuk, depending upon where you put the word Pnima, and that was the suffix and the source of the suffix, the root of the suffix, as to what the status of the makom of the Amatraxin is, whether it has Kedushas Heichal or Kedushas Kodesh Kadosh. Umi Mesapkale, now the Gemara asks the following. We're going to have an additional 5 and possibly an additional 6 cases of psukim where you don't know where to put the comma, whether you put it here and then the next word belongs to the Hemshech HaPasuk, where you put it beyond that word and that word belongs to the first part of the Pasuk. And at least in 5 out of these 6 cases of that dangling modifier kind of situation, we have the statement of Isi ben Yehuda. We're going to see soon that Isi ben Yehuda is the same person as Yosef Ish Hotzal. He had many different names. And we were hoping that this pasuk in Malachim that we spoke about, that Rabbi Yochanan quotes Yosef Ish Hutzal as vacillating back and forth as to how to understand the pasuk and whether or not we put a comma after the Habayis and then Pnima is the Kodesh Kadoshim, or we should put the comma after the word Pnima, and that would mean that the Amatraxin, the Machitza, the Dvir, is part of the Kodesh Kadoshim. That should have been on the list of Isi ben Yehuda's suffix, because we don't know where to put that word Pnima. But yet, as we're going to soon see, the list of Isi ben Yehuda has 5, but not this last suffix. So now we're going to go through the 5 sfekos of Isi ben Yehuda. Chamesh mikros b'Torah. There are 5 tevos in the Torah. In those tzukim with one word, that is Elam Hechre. We don't know whether that word goes back to the beginning of the pasuk, or we should attach it to what comes after that word. It's the beginning of the next phrase in the pasuk. Where do we put the comma? So now we're going to take a look at these 5 cases of, how should I say, unclear mikros.